Hey, welcome back. It's another episode of Flood Geology Failures. Yes, we've already looked at fossil footprints, but we need to take a little deeper dive into fossil footprints. This isn't the last time we're going to visit fossil footprints. I'm going to give you several additional examples, but we're kind of interested in the story from the young Earth creationist perspective this time. How would they explain fossil footprints? So first, let's observe. Animal tracks preserved in stone are found in great abundance, as we've seen before, in many parts of the geological column. So you might be asking yourself, aren't the chances incredibly small that any individual track made in the mud would be preserved over long periods of time? Well, if that's what you're wondering, you'd be right. The vast majority of footprints don't survive the ravages of time. You would have a much greater chance of winning the Powerball lottery than predicting that any particular animal track has a chance of becoming preserved in stone. So the millions of preserved tracks today are essentially all lottery winners. Now, I recently explained that this isn't really that difficult to explain in the context of an ancient Earth. But how might a young Earth creationist, someone who believes the world's only 6,000 years and that old and that the entire geological column, or nearly the entire geological column, was laid down in the space of just a few months, how do they explain the abundance of tracks preserved in stone when they can't appeal to what is probably the most obvious explanation, the accumulation of rare lottery winners occurring over long periods of time? For the young Earth creationists, the odds of an animal track being preserved must be so high that it's the equivalent of saying the odds of winning the library are so high that winning is not the exception, but rather the rule. That's the way I think of young Earth creationist explanation. They think everyone wins the lottery. Now, how does this work? Let's compare the models of Earth's history by doing some simple estimates. Let's do some simple number crunching on how many tracks, we'll call those footprints, each model predicts could have been preserved in the fossil record. We'll focus on just one group of footprints, those made by dinosaurs. So without further ado, let's get started. Fossil footprints, specifically dinosaurs, how frequently could we expect them to be preserved in the fossil record? That's coming up. First, let's start by calculating the number of expected dinosaur footprints, assuming the Earth is millions of years old. So to gain an appreciation for how many footprints have been formed over time and what frequency of preservation is necessary to account for today's observations, I've done some simple calculations. I'm going to share those calculations and my assumptions that stand behind my numbers. So starting off, the number of species alive at any one time. There's thousands of species that have lived at some point in Earth's history, but at one point in history, one specific time slice, like right now, today, there's a certain number of species alive on this Earth that might not be the same number that will be 100 years from now. That's probably not the same number that there were 1,000 years ago. So at any one point, there's thousands of animal species or potentially thousands of dinosaur species alive at one time. Right? Today, there's 10,000 species of birds alive and there's several thousand reptile species. But let's be very conservative. Let's propose that at any one point in time in the past, there were only 50 living species of dinosaurs concurrently alive. So how many individuals then of each of those species would have been alive at any one time? Consider the example of elephants. 100 years ago, there were estimated to be 1 to 3 million African elephants alive at any single time. That was in the 1800s. There were 20 million or more bison alive in North America. Or consider that there's 30 to 50 million domesticated dogs alive today. Dinosaurs weren't all large, and so a conservative estimate would be an average of 1 million living members of each species. That's a very conservative estimate. That gives us a total of 50 million dinosaurs alive during each year. So now, how many footprints are made by an individual per year, right? So we talked about the number of different kinds of dinosaurs, the number of total individual dinosaurs alive. Now, out of all those total of dinosaurs alive, how many footprints could they make? Many individual dinosaurs, they may have never walked in soft mud or wet soil or volcanic ash in a particular year. But surely 1 million of our 50 million dinosaurs would have lived in environments in which they would have left thousands of footprints, if not hundreds of thousands of footprints each year. So let's just say we have 1 million animals, just 1 million out of the 50 million that were alive during that year. And each of those made 1,000 footprints, 1,000 distinct footprints each. I think you can imagine that's a very, very conservative estimate. That would be 1 billion footprints per year, right? So just that number of animals with just 1,000 footprints each year, they're making 1,000 footprints. You could probably argue that there are actually 40 million dinosaurs that made an average of 50,000 footprints each, and that would yield 2 trillion footprints per year. But we're going to just go with that low number of 1 billion footprints per year. So now, how many total footprints were made by individual dinosaurs over millions of years? So now we need to multiply our total footprints made by individuals in a single year by 100 million years of dinosaurs roaming the Earth. Now, I realize dinosaurs are estimated to have roamed the Earth for about 165 million years, but they weren't all that populous in terms of species at the beginning of that, nor probably at the end. So again, we're going to be extremely conservative, and we're just going to say 100 million years. So now we've got 100 million years. We've got 1 billion footprints per year. 1 billion times 100 million is 1 times 10 to the 17th footprints, right? 1 followed by 17 zeros. That's 100 quadrillion footprints that have formed. 100 quadrillion footprints. Again, extremely conservative numbers. It should be apparent by now that if we've used less conservative numbers, we would be looking at numbers in the quintillions or septillions in terms of footprints that were possibly made by individuals throughout the history of the Earth. Well, individual dinosaurs throughout the history of the Earth. We're not even talking about birds or other reptiles and mammals. Now the big question becomes, how many of those footprints could have been preserved for us today? What if 99.999% of those 100 quadrillion footprints were washed away and never preserved? That would still leave us with 10 trillion footprints in the fossil record. That's an enormous number, possibly more than actually exists, although there are certainly billions of dinosaur footprints in the fossil record. However, what if 99.99999% or 1 out of every million footprints were preserved? That would still leave us with 10 billion footprints preserved in the fossil record. To preserve just tens of millions of footprints, had a quintillion or more footprints been formed, would require only 1 out of every 100 billion footprints being preserved. 1 out of 100 billion footprints would need to be preserved in order for us to see the observed number of footprints that we find in layers of rock today. So far, we've only considered dinosaurs. We haven't taken into account birds, mammals, reptile footprints. Put all these numbers together, the number of organisms living over, say, 250 million years, and it quickly becomes obvious, right, that although very infrequently preserved, in other words, a footprint being preserved is like the odds of winning the lottery. Footprints should be very common in the fossil record. That's a prediction from an old Earth perspective of the history of the world. So many organisms have placed their feet on the ground, setting impressions of their feet, that we would be shocked if we didn't find billions of footprints preserved for us. So even if 1 out of every 100 trillion footprints made in the mud or volcanic ash were ever preserved, we'd still have billions of footprints preserved for us today. And this is exactly what we observe. Footprints are a very common form of trace fossil. There are far more footprints than there are individual bones of individuals that made those footprints. Here you're looking at a slab of rock, by the way, from Bolivia. And this single slab of rock, you don't see the whole thing in this picture, but the extent of this rock as it continues beyond your screen, has over 5,000 dinosaur footprints on it, accounting for at least 10 different species. And then there's multiple layers of this rock, and on different layers there is multiple thousands of footprints. So as one layer crumbles or is taken off and removed, another layer exposes a whole nother set of footprints beneath it of different dinosaurs. So just in this one area, there's probably tens, if not hundreds of thousands of dinosaur footprints just in this one little spot in Bolivia. Okay, Now, let's consider these footprints in the young Earth model of Earth's history. If we consider that flood geology scenario of Earth's history, first we have to make note that every single footprint of a dinosaur that we know of that's in the fossil record must have been formed by individual dinosaurs that were alive at the initiation of that flood. Right? They couldn't be dinosaurs that were born and grew up during a flood that only lasted a year. They couldn't have been made by dinosaurs that were dead during the 1600 years between creation and the flood. They could only be made by the dinosaurs alive at that moment. These footprints had to be formed by individuals that were alive right then and there, rather than quadrillions of animals over millions of years making quintillions of footprints. So let's use our same estimates of animals living in one moment of time, which was 50 million dinosaurs. These dinosaurs lived over most of the land surface when suddenly water began to surge catastrophically over the face of the whole Earth. Thousands of feet of sediment, none with dinosaur footprints, were laid down. Right? The bottom layers of the fossil record, no dinosaur footprints there. No dinosaur footprints have ever been found in layers below the Triassic. Later, maybe days, maybe weeks, some dinosaurs which somehow managed to survive the chaotic initial days of the flood, either by swimming for weeks at a time or possibly being on rafts of vegetation that had been torn up. Maybe they're floating around on these rafts, and as these tsunamis and waves cross across the whole Earth and the sediments are settling out, maybe there were patches of sediment that were suddenly visible above the water. And the dinosaurs jumped off their rafts, ran across these sandy beaches. Of course, the next tsunami cycle that comes in, you would expect would wipe out those footprints, right? Just like you walk on a beach, and it's not likely your footprints are going to get preserved, beyond a few minutes, but possibly a few hours. So probably there had to be some drying of that mud to create a sufficiently thick sediment such that when it's stepped on, it forms a structure that's a little more resistant to erosion. Right, so in case you think I just made up this scenario of dinosaurs on rafts and running across sandy spits and then sand covering them up and somehow preserving fossils, right, preserving footprints, I would like to point out that there's a prominent young Earth creationist called Micah Ord, who's actually a meteorologist, who defends the young Earth dinosaur view of track preservation just this way. Let me quote from him. Desperate dinosaurs would likely have found only a series of shoals and banks, either swimming, floating on debris mats, or trapped in higher land nearby. The adult dinosaurs would have climbed onto the fresh deposited sediments, made tracks, quickly laid eggs. There's lots of eggs in the fossil record too. We'll look at those later. When the water rose once again, they would have desperately tried to escape, forming straight trackways on single bedding plains. The rising floodwaters would have also rapidly buried the tracks, a necessary condition for preservation. In fact, the very existence of dino tracks is evidence of rapid burial. So he flips it around, says that the fact that even dinosaur tracks are found at all must be evidence for rapid burial. Well, we see this kind of quote is really common in the young Earth rhetoric, that rapid burial is necessary for preservation of tracks. I'm going to show many examples of tracks that were not formed by rapid burial. I already shown one of them with elephants in the past. Now, surely only a few dinosaurs could have survived long enough to have made any footprints at all. Remember, we talked about maybe 50 million dinosaurs being alive at the onset of the flood, but a large portion of them surely would have been killed by a chaotic rising flood, just like most other organisms are said to have been killed by that flood very early on. So, had millions and millions of dinosaurs survived the majority of the chaos, then we would expect what? Statistically speaking, that some of them would have survived on rafts for the entire flood. I mean, if millions could have survived to nearly the end of the flood and placed their footprints very high in the fossil record right before the end of the flood, surely a few of those millions could have survived all the way through the flood. And yet we're told they didn't. All right, that would contradict young Earth expectations of what the flood was supposed to accomplish, 100% destruction, except those preserved on what? Noah's Ark. So if only 1% survived to the point where they could drag themselves briefly onto land when it became available sometime during that flood year. They may have left, 500,000 soggy and tired dinosaurs romping around on barren sand flats? In a few days, they only have days to do this. At best, they could lay down maybe a couple million tracks. Okay, so yes, the young Earth creationists are correct about one thing, that when you walk on the beach, the next wave will carry your tracks away. That's going to obliterate all evidence you ever walked there. They're all gone. But isn't that exactly what we'd expect to happen with nearly every footprint in the sand and mud created by dinosaurs running from oncoming floodwaters? We would expect that they would have been destroyed, just as we expect 99.9999% of all footprints that we make today to be destroyed, even by less dramatic forces than a chaotic global flood. The global flood scenario would not provide a mechanism or opportunity for preserving many footprints at all. There aren't even that many footprints that could be made because there's not that many individuals to make them. There's not that much time, so they can't make a lot of footprints. And then a large percentage of those footprints aren't expected to be preserved, even in this supposedly good preservation environment. Given the number of dinosaur footprints already discovered in the very small portion of the rock record that we can actually observe, right? I mean, we can only observe a far less than a 1% fraction. We can only observe far less than 1% of all the rocks. Lots of rocks have already eroded, carrying away all the footprints that were contained in them. We only see the surface of some rocks, and most rocks are buried. The very fact that we already have millions of dinosaur footprints available to us tells you that there are billions, if not hundreds of billions of dinosaur footprints in the fossil record, or were in the fossil record before it was eroded. So, there are surely millions and millions of dinosaur footprints preserved in our fossil record. In the conventional geological understanding of Earth's history, these footprints reflect the accumulation of, as we've said, rare events, lottery winners that lead to preservation. However, in the young Earth scenario, rather than a tiny fraction of footprints making their way into the geological record, they must require that the vast majority of footprints made by dinosaurs would have to be preserved. And even that might not account for the number of footprints that we have preserved for us. Hence, the young Earth creationist scenario is as unrealistic as saying that the majority of lottery players will win this week. So what conditions are best for footprint preservation? And we've seen mud flats around temporary ponds, especially in semi-arid environments. Those are the best opportunities for preservation. Water attracts animals. They leave their footprints in the mud around drying lakes and floodplains. When the mud dries, the footprints might take weeks or months to erode, providing an opportunity for them to be covered by a new layer of mud. When the pond suddenly fills up with the local flood. This is not an environment that we would expect to see existing in a global flood. The bits of land appearing very temporarily above the water would have been saturated with water. The air would have been very humid. Mud and clay, if it were even possible to deposit those sediments during a flood, especially in the top layers, they wouldn't have any time to dry or harden before they'd be inundated again. In other words, the conditions for fossil preservation or fossil footprint preservation in a global flood are terrible. Whereas in an old ancient environment where you have ecosystems, lakes, mud, clay, you have many opportunities for preserving just a small fraction of the footprints that are laid down by animals. All right, yet again, we can clearly see the testimony in the rocks below our feet. Preserved footprints are not only explainable by old Earth models, but they're expected. A young Earth scenario does not lead us to the expectation of finding footprints at all. Hence, their great abundance has been met by a concoction of unrealistic ad hoc hypotheses. It would seem a natural expectation of flood geology models that nearly every dinosaur alive on the onset of the global flood would be preserved, but very few of those would leave any trace fossils, such as footprints, as they ran away from the floodwaters. Even in the scenario in which some dinosaurs managed to find a few patches of land to walk on and even lay eggs, only a small percentage of those footprints could be expected to survive. In our scenario, if 50 million dinosaurs were alive at the time of the flood, we expect to find that many fossils eventually, but no more then a subset of those dinosaurs could be responsible for making the tens of millions of footprints that we find in the fossil record. So not only does young Earth creationist geology fail to explain why dinosaur bones are found only in a small portion of the geological column, but now we see that the ratio of bones to footprints is not what we'd expect had the Earth's fossil record been formed solely by a recent global flood. Now, I just wanted to make one other point. A little bit tangential, but I got to stick it somewhere. Right? If millions of dinosaurs were truly adept enough to hitching ride on floating vegetation rafts to survive most of the flood year and then left millions of footprints, why is it that if millions of people were alive during the flood, why is it that if millions of people were alive when the flood struck, that at least a small percentage were also able to climb aboard those rafts and survive just as long enough as dinosaurs did and the other animals? But no fossils of humans have been found in presumed flood deposits, and no footprints of humans have been left behind. Were they really less capable or able to survive the flood than dinosaurs? Once again, I think we've seen a simple case of simple math showing that the flood geology model doesn't add up. Fossil footprints of dinosaurs are easily explained by millions of years, millions of dinosaurs making hundreds of billions and trillions of footprints. Young Earth creationists have to rely on a few dinosaurs making some footprints and every single one of them being preserved, and even that doesn't account for all the fossil footprints that we see. So that's yet another flood geology failure on the behalf of flood geologists. Until next time, thanks for listening. We'll talk to you later. Bye-bye.